Who do you have to trade for, and who is it time to get off your roster in fantasy football? We'll go over that in this week's episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. Each week, I'll give you some of my top trade recommendations, with the goal being to maximize our player value and get the best lineup week in and week out. Some of these recommendations are going to be for your immediate return, and some of them are going to be for kind of more long-term gains. But you can click the link below to get my full Trade Desk article, which covers all of my trade recommendations for this week. We'll start with the bad news and go over the players I'm selling for this week. And we're going to differentiate between two types of selling. We're going to have just guys I want to straight up get off my roster and guys who I'm exploring the market on. The other type of sell is when we run a process on a player, which is when we just explore the fantasy market to see if there's an inflated value for a particular player. And so this week, I'm going to run a process on Houston Texans wide receiver Tank Dell. It's been a really disappointing start to the year for Tank Dell, who's averaging just 7.4 fantasy points per game in the 4 games that he has been healthy. However, he shows up on tons of buy low lists across the industry, and in particular, that has heated up this week with Nico Collins having to leave last week's game against the Bills with an injury. However, I'm going to pivot and take a different tack here. I think that the immediate value that Dell is seeing with Collins' injury means now could be the time to trade Tank Dell. With Collins out, Xavier Hutchinson actually filled pretty much all of Nico Collins' role and ran a route on 67% of dropbacks. He saw an 11% target share, which was the exact same target share that Tank Dell saw against the Buffalo Bills. And Tank Dell has an average depth of target of just 5 yards, so he's not getting those deep shots down the field that Hutchinson and Stephon Diggs are getting. Now, again, with Nico Collins being sidelined, I think people are going to expect some explosion weeks from Tank Dell. And while he may have a good week or two, this is clearly a Texans offense that wants to rotate through multiple options at receiver. And Nico Collins is not expected to be out more than 1 or 2 weeks as of right now. So he's going to come back, and I think that is going to lead to a depression in Dell's fantasy value again. So if you can get value for Tank Dell right now, even if he has 1 or 2 good weeks, I think you're setting yourself up for success down the line this season. In particular, I saw a trade this week on fantasycalc.com where Tank Dell was traded straight up for Puka Nacua, and I really like that as a possible option. The fantasy manager in your league who has Puka Nacua might be struggling. They can't really wait any longer for Puka Nacua. They see the immediate boost in value Tank Dell is going to get, and so they want to go and get that 1 or 2 weeks production. But if you're sitting pretty right now, you're in a good spot. I think getting Puka Nacua for the last few weeks of the season, the second half of the fantasy season, is going to be much more beneficial to you. And if the fantasy manager in your league is struggling with that trade, you can show them that over on fantasylife.com. Right now, the trade analyzer says that that trade is of value to Tank Dell owners, but I think that's going to change in the weeks to come. Now, before we get to the players I'm buying this week, pause this video, comment below. Let me know who you're looking to trade for or trade away, or ask me any trade questions, and I'll answer those as the week goes on. Like with our sells, we're going to have 2 types of buy calls here. And the first one is when we buy a call on a player, which is when we try to get a low-cost stake of a player on our team because we think their value is going to increase in the future weeks. And this week, I'm buying a call on Las Vegas Raiders wide receiver Jakobi Meyers. I think we have seen the end of Davante Adams in a Raiders uniform, and Jakobi Meyers' role over the last 2 weeks suggests that he could be really beneficial for fantasy teams for the remainder of the season. Over the last 2 weeks without Adams on the field, Meyers has run a route on 99% of Raiders dropbacks. He has seen a 32% target share and 40% of the team's air yards with a 28% targets per route run rate. That has led to just 11.6 points per game over those 2 weeks in PPR leagues, but I think that is going to kind of boost in the next few weeks, even if Aiden O'Connell is still at quarterback, because Jakobi Meyers has an average depth of target of just 10 yards, so he's not really running deep shots down the field, but he is going to be peppered with targets, which I think will give him wide receiver 3 upside in PPR formats and also potentially in half PPR formats because that target share is going to be so high. This week, Meyers was traded straight up for Jerry Jeudy. He was traded straight up for Ladd McConkey, and he was traded straight up for Jerome Ford, who figures to see his fantasy value take a hit in the coming weeks when Nick Chubb returns. I also think you could do something where if you had a struggling tight end like Dalton Kincaid or David Njoku, who was hurt in week 1, and you were able to pick up Tucker Kraft on the waiver wire, you could float Kincaid or Njoku and try to get Jakobi Meyers while his value is still low. And the fantasylife.com NFL.com trade analyzer says both of those deals are a benefit to the person getting Myers. So that's just one avenue you could go to get Myers on your team before he explodes. The last buy recommendation is when we buy the dip on a player, and this week I think we should buy the dip on Cleveland Browns wide receiver Amari Cooper. Now, I know it's crazy to suggest buying into the Browns passing attack since the offense looks terrible right now, and Cooper is averaging just 10.6 fantasy points per game in PPR formats. However, I think the usage for Amari Cooper is great right now. He's running around on 94% of dropbacks. He has a 28% target share and a 48% of the team's air yards. The problem is he has just 57% catchable target rate with Deshaun Watson at quarterback, and Watson has continued to airmail Cooper whenever Cooper gets open deep, which has happened multiple times a week. Cooper has also gotten unlucky, getting tackled on the 2-yard line this past week, which prevented a much bigger fantasy day for him. The big issue here is just that Deshaun Watson has been terrible. There's really no way to sugarcoat it. He has been bad, and the Browns are clearly keeping him on the field because they want to get whatever they can out of that contract. But I think it's only a matter of time before the Browns turn to Jameis Winston, or maybe Watson gets suspended because of the increasing legal issues surrounding him. And Amari Cooper is really just a quarterback change away from putting up some massive fantasy numbers. But if you look at fantasycalc.com, a website which tracks the trades made across fantasy leagues, you can get Amari Cooper right now for next to nothing. This week, he was traded straight up for Tony Pollard. He was traded straight up for Keon Coleman. And he was traded straight up for Wan'Dale Robinson. So you can probably get shares of Amari Cooper in your league for nothing, keep him on your bench, and just hope the Browns eventually make a change at quarterback. And Cooper could be a huge asset for you in the second half of the fantasy football season. So I really like trying to get some low-cost shares of Cooper right now. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. As a reminder, you can click the link below to get all of my trade recommendations. Like and subscribe to get this video every week and the rest of our football and fantasy football content over at NBCSports.com. I'll check you next week for another episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. Happy trading.